Chapter 1. A Seasoned Heart and a New Dawn. The sun rose slowly, casting a warm, golden light across the small coastal town. Its rays slipped through the cracks of old shutters and danced over the mist that lingered along the shoreline, gently caressing the quiet streets. Here, each dawn was a familiar greeting, a subtle reminder of the years that had slipped away unnoticed, and for Gabriel, the quiet beauty was like the face of an old friend. He had come to cherish this slow unfolding of morning, like a ritual of his own, a quiet acknowledgement of the paths his life had taken. Gabriel had always lived his life with purpose. A distinguished professor, he had spent his years immersed in the study of literature and history, passionately guiding young minds while quietly surrendering his own dreams. His days were predictable, structured, and shaped by a quiet contentment in solitude, as he found companionship in the pages of his books rather than in the hurried excitement of new relationships. There was a dignity in routine, a sense of security in his solitary existence, but as he sat with his coffee, gazing out over the misty horizon, something stirred within him. Lately, Gabriel had found himself questioning the weight of time, reflecting on the parts of his life he had let slip by in the name of discipline and patience. It was an unsettling yet exhilarating feeling, as if he were on the verge of a new beginning at an age when most had long since settled into their routines. There was a pull in his chest, something that neither books nor logic could explain, something that made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. And then, like a breath of fresh air entering a room long closed off, she arrived. Isabella was a young artist whose presence carried a vibrancy that contrasted sharply with the quiet life of the town. She had moved there seeking peace and inspiration after years of wandering the world, her art a reflection of the passion and curiosity that coursed through her veins. She was a person of colors and contrasts, of vivaciousness and quiet introspection, as though she herself were a piece of art, a fusion of experiences, laughter, and unexpected wisdom. Her appearance stirred the town, bringing a new energy to its streets, and her unmistakable laugh was like a bell ringing out in the stillness, a reminder that life could still surprise them. Gabriel saw her first at the small gallery along the boardwalk, where she was curating an exhibition of her own work. The gallery's warm light spilled onto the pavement outside, a beacon of creativity in the otherwise sedate evening. Gabriel hesitated before stepping inside, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't quite name. The walls were lined with her paintings, bold strokes and vibrant colors that seemed to pulse with life. Each piece told a story, a journey through places Gabriel had only read about, places he had never thought to see. Isabella herself moved through the space like one of her brushstrokes, confident and lively. She was speaking to a small group of visitors, her eyes bright with enthusiasm as she explained the inspiration behind her work, her hands moving expressively as if painting her words in the air. She spoke of far-off lands, of sunsets on remote beaches, and of people whose faces she had captured not with a camera, but through the eyes of memory and feeling. She was, Gabriel realized, unafraid to live fully, to embrace the world and its endless mysteries. And as he watched her, he felt an undeniable sense of awe, a curiosity that stirred in his heart. Gabriel found himself captivated not only by her art, but by the artist herself. He returned to the gallery the next day, and the day after, each visit an unspoken tribute to the newfound fascination that had ignited within him. They exchanged polite nods at first, mere acknowledgments of presence, yet even those brief moments felt charged, a spark that neither fully understood but both felt undeniably. Slowly, he began to see her elsewhere, on the quiet streets, at the cafe on the corner, along the beach where she would walk barefoot in the early mornings, her gaze lost in the horizon. Isabella was unlike anyone he had ever known. She possessed a lightness and a spontaneity that clashed with his more reserved nature, Yet something in her reminded him of the younger man he had once been. She was the embodiment of a life lived freely, a testament to following one's heart without fear of judgment or failure. Gabriel began to sense that their encounters were more than mere coincidence. It was as though fate, or perhaps some deeper part of his soul, was gently nudging him toward her, urging him to step beyond the boundaries he had always known. He became acutely aware of his age, of the years he had spent shaping his life into the image of stability and wisdom, and the potential discomfort of daring to disrupt it now. Yet, there was a deep, unspoken connection he felt whenever their paths crossed, a connection that seemed to defy logic, transcending the years that separated them. One afternoon, as he sat on his favorite bench by the ocean, he noticed her walking toward him, her arms wrapped around a sketchbook as she took in the view. She glanced his way and offered a soft smile, a smile that held a warmth he hadn't felt in years. In that moment, Gabriel felt a spark of hope, a reminder that life could still surprise him, that perhaps he had yet to experience the fullness of what it could offer. The walls he had built so carefully around his heart began to feel less like fortresses and more like fragile boundaries, ones he could step beyond if he only dared. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the water, he found himself reflecting on the barriers of age, the invisible lines that society drew between generations. He wondered if love, too, was meant to be bound by time, or if it could exist as something timeless beyond years and conventions. It was a question that lingered in his mind, a thought that planted itself within him, growing roots deep into the heart he had long believed too old for such notions. There, under the fading light, Gabriel felt a stirring he could not ignore, a gentle urging, like the turning of a new season, as if the universe itself were inviting him to rediscover what it meant to live, to feel, and to love. Chapter 2. Paths Crossed by Fate. The days rolled on, bringing with them the subtle changes of the season. Summer's warmth still lingered, but the evenings grew cooler, and the air held the first hints of autumn's crispness. The town's quiet charm seemed to settle deeper into itself, like a familiar melody playing in the background of each resident's life. Yet, for Gabriel, each morning felt a little different now. A quiet anticipation had begun to take root, an awareness that something was shifting within him. It had been years since he'd felt so drawn to another person, and the realization unsettled him. Gabriel was a man who lived by principles, who had carefully curated a life marked by restraint and patience. And yet, in the days since he first saw Isabella, he found himself reaching for things he couldn't easily grasp, emotions, possibilities, moments unclaimed. He hadn't known how starved he was for connection until the idea of it had found him, filling him with a longing that he could neither explain nor resist. The chance encounters with Isabella continued, each one as brief and inconspicuous as the last, and yet they were beginning to take on a life of their own in his mind. He began to frequent the places he knew she visited. The small cafe on the corner, the gallery where her paintings adorned the walls, the stretch of beach where she walked alone in the early mornings, lost in her thoughts. He wondered if she noticed him as he noticed her, if she too felt the unspoken thread that seemed to pull them together, even in their silence. Isabella, too, was aware of Gabriel's presence, though she couldn't explain why it affected her as much as it did. She had always been a free spirit, a woman who thrived on independence and spontaneity, yet she felt a strange comfort in his quiet, steady gaze. There was something about him that reminded her of the strength in stillness, of the beauty in reflection. He was different from the people she knew, different from the whirlwind of energy and creativity that usually surrounded her. And while she couldn't name it, she felt drawn to him in a way that defied logic or understanding. One evening, as she sat by the beach sketching the waves that rolled gently to shore, she became acutely aware of his presence nearby. Gabriel was seated a short distance away on his usual bench, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It was a quiet moment, one that felt strangely intimate despite the distance between them. She glanced over at him, taking in his contemplative expression, the slight furrow in his brow, the way his hands rested in his lap, calm and assured. In that moment, she felt a kinship she hadn't anticipated. Though their lives had taken vastly different paths, there was a shared understanding in the silence between them, an unspoken recognition of lives marked by choices and sacrifices. She wondered what his story was, what roads he had traveled to arrive at this quiet town, and what thoughts lay hidden behind his reserved exterior. And as she turned back to her sketchbook, she found herself drawing him, a quick, simple rendering of a figure gazing out to sea, grounded yet alone. As the days passed, they settled into a quiet rhythm, each of them weaving the other into the fabric of their daily routines. Gabriel would watch her from his usual place on the boardwalk as she gathered inspiration from the world around her, capturing the essence of life in her sketches and paintings. Isabella, in turn, grew accustomed to his presence, to the steady comfort of knowing he was there, a constant in the unpredictable landscape of her life. In the quiet moments, Gabriel found himself reflecting on the nature of fate, on the unseen forces that brought two people together in ways they could never have foreseen. He was a man who had always believed in reason and purpose, who had lived his life according to principles and careful choices. And yet, there was something undeniably serendipitous about his encounters with Isabella, something that felt less like coincidence and more like destiny's quiet hand, guiding them together in its own time and way. One afternoon, he found himself walking along the narrow paths that wound through the town's historic district, his mind drifting to thoughts of Isabella. The cobbled streets, lined with quaint shops and flowering vines, held an air of nostalgia that resonated deeply with him. He had walked these paths many times over the years, but now, each step felt infused with a new purpose, a quiet urgency he hadn't known before. It was as though he were following a path that had been laid before him long ago, a journey he was only now beginning to understand. As he rounded a corner, he saw her ahead of him, standing in front of a small antique shop, her attention captured by something in the window. She was bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun, her figure illuminated like a painting come to life. Gabriel paused, watching her from a distance, his heart stirred by the simplicity of the scene. It was a quiet, unassuming moment, yet it felt monumental, as if he were witnessing the unfolding of a story he had been waiting his whole life to see. He moved closer, keeping his steps quiet so as not to disturb her. In the window, he saw what had caught her attention: a delicate music box, its brass gears and intricate carvings a relic of another time. She stood transfixed, her gaze soft as she took in the details of the box, her fingers hovering over the glass as if she could feel its history, its hidden stories. Gabriel found himself wondering what memories it stirred for her, what echoes of the past lay dormant within her mind. As she turned away from the window, her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, they stood frozen in the stillness of that shared gaze. In her eyes, he saw a depth of feeling, an unspoken connection that transcended the barriers of age, of time, of the separate lives they had lived. It was a fleeting moment, yet it held an eternity within it, a recognition that they were both travelers on the same journey, bound by forces neither of them could name. She offered him a gentle smile, one that held both warmth and understanding, as though she, too, sensed the quiet inevitability of their bond. He returned the smile, his heart stirred by the simplicity and the beauty of that small gesture, and as she walked away, he felt the unmistakable tug of fate pulling him forward, urging him to follow a path he had only just begun to see. As Gabriel stood there, watching her disappear into the distance, he felt a sense of clarity settle over him. a quiet understanding that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. And though he was a man of reason, a man who had always placed his trust in logic and structure, he found himself willing, even eager, to follow this new path, wherever it might lead. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, as though he had awakened from a long, quiet slumber to find the world bursting with color, with possibility, with the promise of a life yet unlived. And as he turned to leave, the soft strains of a melody drifted from the antique shop, the delicate sound of the music box filling the air, a gentle reminder that some things, like love and fate, were beyond reason, beyond understanding, existing only in the quiet spaces where hearts dared to dream. Chapter 3. The Heart's Quiet Yearning. The days passed with a steady rhythm, each one bringing Gabriel and Isabella closer in small, imperceptible ways. Though they still barely knew one another, there was a comfort in the simple act of their shared presence. Neither spoke nor sought out introductions, yet their lives seemed to follow an unseen pattern, like separate melodies entwining to form a subtle, harmonious duet. In this quiet, unspoken connection, they found a refuge from the demands of their individual lives. For Gabriel, each encounter with Isabella held a sense of newness, a quiet thrill that was both foreign and familiar. He often found himself returning to the places they frequented, the beach, the boardwalk, the historic streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. His life, once carefully arranged around routine and self-imposed solitude, had begun to take on a softer rhythm. Thoughts of her lingered in the spaces between his daily tasks, weaving themselves into his routine in a way he couldn't control. In his quiet moments, he would find himself wondering about her life, her dreams, and the thoughts she held close to her heart. What was it that drew her to the sea each morning? What memories did she carry in her quiet gaze? He felt a desire to know her that was as gentle as it was relentless, a need to understand the woman who had, without a word, become a part of his world. He could sense an underlying strength within her, a resilience tempered by softness. It was a paradox that intrigued him, that filled him with a yearning he hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, Isabella found herself inexplicably drawn to the places she knew Gabriel would be. She had always been one to drift from one inspiration to another, a free spirit unbound by routine. Yet she found herself returning to the beach at the same hour each morning, lingering on the boardwalk longer than usual, hoping to feel the comfort of his quiet presence. She had long believed that her art would always be her greatest passion, that no one could stir her heart as deeply as the colors and textures of her work. But now, she found herself sketching not only the landscape around her, but fragments of him as well, the angle of his brow, the solemn curve of his mouth, the way he looked out over the water as though searching for something he had lost. One misty morning, as the world lay draped in soft, muted colors, they crossed paths at the edge of the beach. The sky was painted with gentle hues of gray and lavender, the horizon blurred as if the sea and sky were woven together. Gabriel stood near the water, his eyes trained on the waves, their constant rise and fall echoing the quiet rhythm within him. Isabella approached, her footsteps light on the sand, and paused just a few steps away, feeling the stillness between them, as fragile and as tangible as the mist that hung in the air. In that quiet moment, she became acutely aware of the vulnerability that lay beneath her own calm exterior. There was something about him that made her feel both seen and understood, a rarity she hadn't expected to find in the quiet corners of her life. She realized she was not only drawn to him, but also to the parts of herself that she felt reflected in his silent gaze. The hopes and dreams she had once held close, the parts of herself she had long hidden away. As the morning mist began to lift, Gabriel felt an unexplainable urge to reach out to her, to close the distance that lay between them. But he hesitated held back by the weight of his own uncertainties, his own fears. He had built his life on restraint, on carefully measured steps, and though he longed to break free of those self-imposed boundaries, he found himself caught in the tension between desire and doubt. Still, his heart surged with an unfamiliar restlessness, a need to bridge the gap that separated them, not only in years but in the vast landscapes of experience that had shaped each of them. Isabella sensed this inner conflict within him, even without words. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the tension that flickered across his face as he looked at her, as though he were searching for something he couldn't quite name. And though she was younger, she felt a wisdom in her heart that reached beyond years, a quiet understanding that some connections defied the constraints of time or convention. She knew that whatever force had brought them together was as delicate as it was powerful, and she was determined to let it unfold naturally, to allow space for whatever their paths would bring. The morning sun began to break through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the beach. Isabella turned and walked a few paces along the shore, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Behind her, Gabriel watched, feeling a pang of longing as he saw her silhouette bathed in sunlight. There was a beauty in her solitude, a quiet grace that reminded him of a melody he could not place, something haunting and eternal. In that moment, he realized that the yearning he felt was not just for her, but for something she represented, a reminder of life's possibilities, of the paths he had chosen and the ones he had yet to explore. In the days that followed, Gabriel found himself drawn to the spaces they had shared, feeling an almost magnetic pull that he couldn't resist. He was a man who had always believed in reason, in careful planning, yet his attraction to Isabella felt anything but rational. He found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions, the thrill of attraction tempered by the weight of his past, the responsibilities he had carried, the life he had built on foundations of caution. And yet, when he thought of her, he felt a warmth that cut through the fog of his uncertainties, a gentle but persistent call to embrace the unknown. Isabella, too, found herself navigating a sea of emotions she hadn't anticipated. She had always believed that love would find her in its own time, that she would recognize it without hesitation. But now, faced with the quiet, complex presence of Gabriel, she felt both exhilarated and uncertain, as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out over an endless expanse. There was an intensity in her feelings for him that both frightened and thrilled her, a depth of emotion that she knew could change the course of her life. Each encounter deepened their connection, though neither of them dared to name it. They were bound by unspoken understandings, by the shared moments of stillness and solitude that lay between them. It was as if fate itself had carved out a space for them, a space where age and convention faded away, leaving only the purity of their feelings. And though they each carried their own fears and doubts, they found comfort in the knowledge that, for now, they were simply two souls drawn together by something far greater than themselves. The days grew shorter, the air crisper, and the town began to take on the quiet beauty of autumn. The leaves turned shades of amber and crimson, casting a warm glow over the streets, and the world seemed to mirror the emotions that had taken root in Gabriel and Isabella's hearts. There was a richness to the season, a promise of change, of transformation that resonated deeply within each of them. They could feel the inevitability of what lay between them, the slow, steady growth of something neither of them could deny. In the stillness of those days, they began to let go of their reservations, their fears, allowing themselves to be swept up in the gentle current that fate had woven around them. They were two people from different worlds, different times. Yet in the quiet moments they shared, they found a connection that transcended all that lay between them. And as autumn's colors deepened, so too did their unspoken bond, their hearts quietly yearning for the possibility of a love that knew no boundaries. Chapter 4. The Space Between Years. Autumn settled across the coastal town, draping the streets in a tapestry of rich color and crisp air. The beach, once lively with families and laughter, grew quieter, almost reflective, as if it were mirroring the changes stirring within both Gabriel and Isabella. Their encounters remained wordless, yet with each passing day, the silent understanding between them grew, as steady as the tide that rose and fell along the shore. Gabriel found himself drifting into new routines, subtly shaped around his quiet, unspoken bond with Isabella. He wandered into the same coffee shop each morning, a place he knew she visited often. The space was cozy, with large windows that overlooked the sea, and he would sit at a small table by the window, gazing out at the waves as they mirrored the restlessness in his heart. In these moments, he would catch sight of her as she entered, her presence filling the room with an almost unintentional grace. Her hair was often tucked beneath a hat, her hands clutching a notebook or a cup of coffee, and she would sit across the room, unaware of how completely she had captivated his thoughts. There was a depth to her gaze that Gabriel could not ignore, a quiet wisdom that seemed to contradict her youth. He found himself wondering about her past, about the experiences that had shaped her, the dreams she had yet to share. In the hours they spent in the same room, a silent dance played out between them, each one aware of the other's presence, yet neither daring to break the spell with words. They were like two travelers on a parallel journey, each moving toward a destination unknown, bound by an invisible thread that grew stronger with each passing day. For Isabella, the connection felt both exhilarating and bittersweet. She could feel Gabriel's gaze upon her, a subtle warmth that lingered in the space between them, and she found herself drawn to him in ways she had not anticipated. She was aware of the unspoken boundaries between them, the difference in age, in life experiences, but these distinctions faded in his presence, replaced by a sense of belonging she had not known before. Each morning as she sipped her coffee and sketched quietly in her notebook, she felt his steady presence beside her, a grounding force that gave her a sense of stability she hadn't realized she had been searching for. In her sketches, she began to capture fragments of him. The curve of his jaw, the contemplative way he looked out at the sea, the gentle lines that marked his face, speaking of a life well lived and perhaps a little guarded. Her pencil moved with a certain tenderness, as if she were trying to capture not just his image, but the quiet depth of his spirit. She knew little of his life, of the path that had brought him here. But in these stolen moments, she felt as though she understood him in ways that transcended words. Their shared moments in the cafe became a ritual, a silent communion that each of them looked forward to, though neither dared acknowledge it. There was comfort in the routine, in the knowledge that each day would bring them back to this place, to this shared space that felt suspended in time. They moved through their days like actors in a play, each one aware of the other's role, yet both reluctant to take the next step, to give voice to the connection that had taken root between them. As the leaves began to fall, blanketing the streets in shades of amber and gold, Gabriel and Isabella continued their quiet, unspoken journey. There were days when he felt an overwhelming urge to reach out to her, to close the distance that lay between them, but he held back, restrained by the weight of his own fears and uncertainties. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to the quiet comfort of his own company, and though he yearned for the warmth of her presence, he feared the vulnerability that came with opening his heart. In these moments of doubt, he would retreat to the familiar embrace of the sea, walking along the shore as the waves whispered their secrets, grounding him in the steady rhythm of nature. He found solace in the endless horizon, in the knowledge that some things in life were constant, unchanging. But even the ocean, with its timeless beauty, could not quell the restlessness within him, the quiet yearning that grew stronger with each encounter, urging him to embrace the unknown. Isabella, too, found herself drawn to the sea in moments of reflection. She would sit on the rocks that lined the shore, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, watching the waves as they crashed against the stones. There was a wildness to the ocean that mirrored the emotions stirring within her, a reminder of the vastness of life, of the mysteries that lay beyond the horizon. She felt a sense of kinship with Gabriel, a bond that was as natural as the tide, a connection that defied logic or reason. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the water, Isabella ventured to the beach once more, drawn by an urge she couldn't explain. She found Gabriel there, standing at the edge of the shore, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. There was a stillness to him, a quiet strength that resonated deeply within her. She watched him from a distance, sensing the weight of his thoughts, the unspoken feelings that lay between them. In that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of clarity, a realization that the path she was on was no longer hers alone. She was standing on the precipice of something profound, something that could change the course of her life. The wind carried the scent of salt and earth, filling her lungs with a sense of freedom, of possibility. She could feel her heart beating with a new rhythm, a quiet anticipation that filled her with both excitement and fear. The sunset cast long shadows across the sand, and in that fleeting moment, their paths seemed to converge, bound by an invisible force that neither of them could deny. Gabriel felt her presence behind him, a warmth that settled over him like the embrace of the setting sun. He knew, without looking, that she was there, that their lives were intertwined in ways he could not explain. The realization filled him with both hope and trepidation, a reminder that the heart, once opened, could never be closed again. As the final rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, they remained there, two figures silhouetted against the fading light, each one silently acknowledging the bond they shared. They were like two stars in the night sky, drawn together by a force that was both mysterious and undeniable. And though the path ahead was uncertain, they felt a quiet assurance that whatever lay beyond the horizon, they would face it together. In the days that followed, their encounters took on a new significance, a quiet promise that lingered in the space between them. They continued their rituals, their silent exchanges, each one savoring the simplicity of their shared moments. They knew that words would come eventually, that the time would come to confront the reality of their feelings. But for now, they were content to let their connection unfold naturally, to allow the seasons to shape their journey, as steady and timeless as the rhythm of the sea. The autumn leaves fell, blanketing the town in a gentle reminder of life's impermanence, of the beauty that lay in each fleeting moment. And as Gabriel and Isabella moved through their days, they felt a quiet joy, a sense of purpose that transcended the barriers of age, of experience. They were two souls bound by a love that was both fragile and resilient, a connection that would carry them through the challenges that lay ahead, a love that, like the sea, was deep and eternal. Chapter 5. Where Wisdom Meets Wonder. As winter approached, the coastal town transformed, its familiar streets and shoreline wrapped in a cool stillness, with only the steady pulse of the waves to break the silence. For Gabriel, the change in season felt like an invitation to look deeper, to let go of the guardedness that had protected him for so long. In the quiet intervals of his days, he found himself thinking of Isabella more often, lingering on her image as if she were woven into the very fabric of his memories. It was as though the gentle rhythm of her presence had settled into his life without him even noticing. He would sit at his desk, going over sketches for his architecture work, only to find himself caught up in a recollection of her laughter, rare as it was, but bright as a sudden shaft of sunlight breaking through clouds. The silence between them had somehow become a language of its own, one he was learning to listen to with an attentiveness he hadn't known he possessed. In each shared moment, each fleeting glance, he discovered layers of meaning that left him both exhilarated and uncertain. Isabella, too, found herself thinking of Gabriel with a frequency that both puzzled and inspired her. Her days were spent in the solitude of her creative work. Hours passed by with her sketchbook as she captured the ebb and flow of her emotions in line and shade. But as the days grew shorter, the sea darker and the skies pale, her thoughts would drift inevitably to Gabriel, like a tide returning to shore. She wondered what stories his eyes held, what dreams he had once cherished, and what fears had made him retreat from the world. Her curiosity about him was a steady undercurrent, drawing her closer, compelling her to look past his silence and into the depths of his soul. One overcast afternoon, Isabella sat by the shore, the cold, briny wind curling around her as she sketched the skeletal trees along the beach. Their bare branches stretched up toward the sky, a stark contrast to the memory of summer's lush greenery, yet beautiful in their quiet resilience. She traced the lines with a steady hand, her mind wandering, drawn to the image of Gabriel's face, to the hints of sorrow that lingered in his gaze, the weight of experiences unshared. She realized, as her pencil moved across the page, that she wanted to know more, to understand him beyond the brief glimpses they shared. Though she could feel the gap between them, a chasm shaped by years, she also sensed the connection that bound them, growing with each passing day. In Gabriel, she saw a life already written, a history etched in each line on his face, each shadow that darkened his gaze. Yet she wondered if perhaps he, too, was searching for something, someone who could read between the lines of his life, someone who could accept him as he was, not in spite of his past, but because of it. Gabriel's afternoons were often spent walking along the cliffs, his solitary path traced against the gray horizon. From this vantage point, he could see the whole town, the roofs clustered together like scattered leaves, the sea stretching out endlessly beyond. He would stop, breathing in the cold air, feeling the weight of the past lifting slightly as he looked toward the future with cautious hope. In Isabella's presence, he felt the stirring of something he had thought lost, the hope of being truly understood, of being seen for who he was, flaws and all. There were moments when he considered reaching out to her, telling her the stories that lay hidden within him, but he always stopped short, held back by the awareness of the life that separated them. He had lived through experiences that had hardened him, shaped him into someone who moved with caution. Yet, with her, he felt as though he were being given a second chance, an invitation to leave behind the safe silence he had built around himself and step into something vibrant and new. One evening, as the sky turned dark with the promise of snow, Gabriel found himself near the cafe where they had first seen each other. He paused, leaning against the cold stone wall, his mind adrift in thoughts of her. The light from the windows spilled out onto the street, casting a warm glow, and he could see the familiar figure of Isabella inside, sketching as always, her face lit softly by the dim lamps. He felt drawn to her in a way that defied all logic, a pull that transcended time, age, and even reason. In that moment, he realized that he had been waiting for her. Perhaps not consciously, but some part of him, the part that still held on to hope, had been waiting for someone like her. Someone who could breathe life into the quiet spaces within him. Someone who could remind him of the beauty that still existed in the world, even in its most fragile and fleeting forms. Isabella felt the same magnetic force, an unspoken bond that drew her to him like the pull of the tide. She could feel it in the quiet moments when they were simply near each other, two souls moving in tandem, like stars circling in the same orbit. She sensed his hesitations, the invisible barriers he had placed around himself, and while she respected them, she also felt a gentle urge to reach out, to break through the walls he had built, to let him know that he did not have to face the world alone. The days continued to pass, the weather growing colder, yet the warmth between them only intensified, a steady flame that neither snow nor distance could extinguish. Their lives had become intertwined, bound by an unspoken understanding, a mutual respect that bridged the gaps of age and experience. Each glance, each subtle gesture, carried a message, a promise that transcended words. In the quiet sanctuary of their shared moments, they found a peace that defied explanation. Isabella knew that this connection was rare, that it was a gift to be cherished, and she resolved to nurture it, to let it grow naturally, unhurried by the expectations of the world. She could feel the quiet strength of Gabriel's presence beside her, a constant that anchored her as she navigated her own journey, and she knew that whatever path lay ahead, it was one they would face together. The winter brought with it a sense of stillness, a pause in the rush of life that allowed them to simply be, to exist in each other's company without the need for words or declarations. They were like two leaves caught in the same current, drifting together toward an unknown destination, yet content in the knowledge that they were not alone. The bond they shared was deepening, evolving into something that went beyond mere companionship or attraction. It was a connection that seemed timeless, an echo of something ancient, as though their souls had recognized each other long before they had met. As the first snowflakes began to fall, blanketing the town in a quiet stillness, they walked side by side along the shore, each one lost in their own thoughts yet fully aware of the other's presence. In that moment, there was no need for words, no need to explain the depth of their feelings. They were simply together, two souls bound by a love that had transcended time, age, and even the silence that lay between them. And as they walked beneath the starlit sky, each step leaving a trail in the freshly fallen snow, they knew that they were on the brink of something beautiful, something that would require courage, patience, and trust. They had crossed the boundaries of time, of life's countless challenges, and in the quiet spaces between their footsteps, a future began to take shape, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. In the end, it was not the age or the circumstances that mattered, but the quiet, steady love that had grown between them, a love that was as constant as the sea, as enduring as the stars. And as they walked together, hand in hand, through the silent embrace of winter, they felt a quiet certainty that their journey had only just begun. Chapter 6: Bridges Across Decades. As winter settled firmly upon the town, the days stretched longer in their quiet simplicity, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the lives unfolding in its midst. Snow blanketed the rooftops and paths, softening the world around them, muffling the sounds of daily life, creating an unbroken stillness that was almost reverent. The ocean, once boisterous and alive, lay calm and serene, its waves lapping gently against the frozen shore as if in respect to the season's hush. In the heart of this serene landscape, Gabriel and Isabella's connection continued to grow, unspoken but undeniable, as steadfast as the quiet that surrounded them. Gabriel found himself drawn more frequently to the cliffs, his footsteps carving trails through the snow-covered paths as he walked, alone but for the thoughts that now constantly lingered on Isabella. He felt a peace in her presence that he had not known he needed, a calm that allowed him to confront his own insecurities, to unearth memories and dreams he had long since buried. In her, he saw the embodiment of a quiet strength, an acceptance that seemed boundless, and he found himself wondering if he could be deserving of it. His years had taught him to move with caution, to guard his heart, yet with her, he found the courage to let those walls crumble bit by bit, to leave behind the solitude he had carried for so long. For Isabella, the winter days held a beauty that went beyond the snow-dusted landscapes or the silvered light of dusk. She sensed something shifting within her, a growing resolve to cherish each moment, to embrace the journey she was on with Gabriel despite the uncertainties that lay ahead. Her heart was drawn to him in a way that transcended reason, as if she had always known that her path would one day lead to him. She found solace in his silence, strength in his gaze, and a kindred spirit who seemed to understand the depths of her without the need for words. In her sketchbook, she often captured fleeting images of him, shaded in the soft, muted tones of winter. The lines of his face, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the unguarded moments she had glimpsed in his presence. The days passed quietly, and in their unhurried rhythm, Isabella and Gabriel began to develop routines that intertwined their lives in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. They would meet by the shore at dawn, their breath visible in the cold air as they stood together, side by side, watching the sun rise over the horizon. The light, pale and fragile in the early hours, would cast a golden hue across the waves, illuminating the frozen landscape in a delicate warmth. In these quiet moments, they found themselves sharing a profound intimacy, the kind that needed no words to be understood. Gabriel found himself growing protective of these moments, cherishing the simplicity of standing beside her, feeling the silent connection between them as real and as constant as the tides. He marveled at the way their lives had come together, seemingly by chance yet bound by a force that felt almost destined. There were times when he wanted to reach out, to express what he felt for her, but he held back, knowing that words could not fully capture the depth of what was growing between them. He feared breaking the delicate balance they had created, worried that too much might disturb the beauty of their shared silence. Isabella, too, sensed the fragility of their bond, and yet she embraced it fully, allowing herself to be present, to feel each moment without the pressure of defining it. She understood that Gabriel carried a past that weighed heavily on him, a history that had shaped him, and she respected the boundaries he had created around it. She was content to wait, to let their connection evolve naturally, trusting that in time, he would share his heart with her fully, unreservedly. For now, she was happy to stand beside him, to hold his hand in spirit if not in truth, and to let the quiet devotion between them blossom like the flowers that would one day emerge from the snow. As the season wore on, they began to take longer walks together, exploring the town and its surroundings, discovering places that held stories within them. They wandered through the narrow streets, past the ancient stone walls and weathered cottages, each step a continuation of the journey they were taking together. Isabella would pause to capture these scenes in her sketches, her pencil moving with a fluid grace, tracing the details of their shared surroundings with an artist's eye and a lover's heart. In her drawings, she captured not just the landscape, but the moments they shared, the quiet looks and gentle gestures that spoke of the growing bond between them. Gabriel watched her with a quiet admiration, marveling at her ability to bring life to the simplest of things. In her art, he saw reflections of his own thoughts and feelings, as if she were capturing the very essence of what lay between them. He knew that she was more than a passing figure in his life, more than a fleeting connection. She was, in many ways, a mirror that revealed parts of himself he had long forgotten, a light that illuminated the shadows within him. And as he walked beside her, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to embrace the vulnerability that came with opening his heart once again. In the stillness of their shared winter, Gabriel and Isabella found themselves growing ever closer, drawn together by an unspoken promise that defied the boundaries of time and circumstance. They had become like the snow-covered trees that lined the shore, strong, resilient, and rooted in the quiet certainty of their connection. Each day, they walked a little farther, explored a little deeper, uncovering not just the beauty of their surroundings, but the depths of each other. And in the heart of winter, they discovered a warmth that went beyond the cold, a love that was as constant and enduring as the snow itself. The world around them continued in its quiet rhythm, the season unfolding in its own time, and in the silence, they found a love that was pure and unadorned, untouched by the expectations of others or the constraints of the world. It was a love born of patience, of acceptance, of a silent devotion that needed no validation beyond the moments they shared. And as they walked through the snow-covered landscape, hand in hand, they knew that they were bound by a bond that was as timeless as the winter itself, a love that would endure long after the snow had melted and the world had changed. For now, they were content to let the silence speak for them, to let the quiet devotion between them grow, unhurried and unbreakable. And as they stood together beneath the vast, starlit sky, they knew that their journey was only beginning, that they had found something rare and precious, a love that was as enduring as the stars themselves. Chapter 7. Love Beyond Measure. As winter's deepest chill reached its peak, the world seemed to take a slow, steady breath, holding onto a stillness that mirrored the growing intimacy between Gabriel and Isabella. The snow lay thick on the ground, a silent witness to the quiet devotion that had blossomed between them, like a blanket that held their secret close. Nature itself seemed to pause in reverence, aware of the changes unfolding quietly in their hearts, honoring the love that, despite its subtlety, had grown more resolute than the frozen earth beneath their feet. Gabriel found himself awakening each morning with a newfound sense of purpose, his thoughts drawn to Isabella with a warmth that defied the frigid air outside. In the depths of winter, he felt a rejuvenation, a revival that reminded him of the seasons of his youth. He was no longer just a man shaped by past regrets or tempered by caution. He had become, once more, a man capable of feeling deeply, of yearning, of allowing his heart to be unguarded in a way he hadn't thought possible. Isabella's presence in his life had reignited something profound within him, a light that pierced the shadows he had accepted as his only companions. Though they still moved in silence, the unspoken words between them were palpable, an invisible bond that had no need for verbal confirmation. Gabriel's world was one of measured restraint, a place where every choice had been made with careful thought and tempered control. But in Isabella's gentle presence, he found himself relaxing, feeling as if life had offered him a reprieve, a second chance to know the kind of love that transcended the bounds of age, time, and circumstance. She was not just someone who had crossed his path, but a soul whose presence resonated deeply within his own, as though she were a long-forgotten part of himself now made whole. Isabella, in her own way, was aware of the magnitude of her feelings for Gabriel, a love that had come unbidden but settled firmly within her, like roots finding fertile ground. Her days had taken on a new hue, filled with moments that seemed to capture eternity in the simplest of gestures. A look, a shared breath, a gentle smile exchanged across a snow-covered landscape. She had always believed herself to be attuned to life's beauty, but with him, every detail seemed brighter, as if her very soul had been infused with a new depth of color and vibrancy. It was a love that felt infinite, boundless, as though it had existed long before they met and would continue long after, woven into the fabric of their very beings. Their walks grew longer, often leading them beyond the familiar paths near the sea and deeper into the winding trails that led into the nearby woods. Here, amidst towering pines and sprawling oaks, they found themselves wrapped in a silence that seemed to echo the steadiness of their bond. Gabriel would walk slightly ahead, as if instinctively protecting her from the unseen, while Isabella trailed closely behind, taking in his silhouette against the snow-laden trees, feeling a warmth that belied the biting cold around them. As they ventured further into the forest, Gabriel was struck by the resilience of the trees around them, their trunks thick and strong, their branches reaching skyward, unyielding to the weight of the snow that clung to them. These trees had weathered countless winters, their roots burrowed deep into the earth, their branches scarred by storms, yet standing tall and unwavering. He saw in them a reflection of his own life, a journey marked by hardship and solitude, yet rooted in something unbreakable. Isabella, in contrast, was like the new growth that emerged each spring, vibrant and hopeful, filling the spaces around him with life and warmth. The forest held an ethereal quality, its shadows deep and inviting, as though it, too, sensed the sacred nature of their connection. Isabella felt an almost reverent sense of peace here, her heart attuned to the gentle rhythm of nature, mirroring the steady beat of her love for Gabriel. She would stop now and then to run her fingers along the bark of an ancient tree or pause to admire the soft light filtering through the branches, her thoughts drifting to the man beside her, to the quiet strength he carried within him. She marveled at how seamlessly he had become a part of her world, how effortlessly they had found themselves in harmony, like two notes of a song that had always existed but had only now found their true melody. Gabriel, too, sensed this harmony, a resonance that felt timeless, as though he and Isabella were not just two souls who had found each other by chance, but two beings who had always belonged together, destined to meet at this precise moment. He felt an overwhelming gratitude, a deep respect for the love that had grown between them, a love that asked for nothing but offered everything. It was a love without measure, without expectation, a love that transcended all he had known, a love that allowed him to be both protector and beloved, strong yet vulnerable, whole yet willing to share his life with another. As they emerged from the forest and made their way back toward the shore, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the snow-covered earth. They stood side by side, watching the sky deepen into shades of rose and violet, a quiet reverence settling over them. Gabriel felt the urge to reach for her hand, to hold it as a silent promise, a vow that needed no words. But instead, he simply stood beside her, letting the silence speak for him, knowing that she understood, that she felt the same timeless love that bound them together. In that moment, as the world around them was bathed in the soft light of dusk, they both felt the weight of their love, a love that had no beginning and no end, a love that was as constant and as profound as the earth beneath their feet. It was a love beyond measure, a love that would sustain them through the changing seasons, through the challenges that lay ahead. They were two souls who had found each other against all odds, and in that, they knew they had been granted a gift beyond anything they could have ever dreamed. The night descended slowly, blanketing the world in a quiet calm, as Gabriel and Isabella made their way back, their hearts full, their love steady and unbreakable. They walked together through the snow, leaving behind footprints that would soon be covered, yet knowing that their journey together had only just begun. And as they entered the warmth of their separate homes, they carried with them the certainty of a love that could never be diminished, a love that was truly beyond measure. Chapter 8: Hearts Outpacing Time. As the final frost of winter slowly began to yield to the first stirrings of spring, an unspoken understanding settled between Gabriel and Isabella. It was an understanding forged in the countless quiet moments they had shared, in the slow, steady rhythm of their time together, and in the silent promises they exchanged without the need for words. In the stillness of early spring, their love took on a deeper dimension, one that transcended the usual bounds of spoken confessions or overt gestures. It was a love built on the quiet promises they had made to each other in every glance, every touch, and every shared silence. Gabriel felt this shift in his own heart, a deepening of emotions he had not fully expected but now embraced. His life, once measured and meticulously ordered, had expanded to accommodate this new feeling, this boundless love that seemed to grow with each passing day. He no longer viewed himself solely through the lens of his past, nor did he measure his worth by the accomplishments he had once held so dear. Instead, he felt a renewed purpose, a quiet joy that infused his days with meaning, rooted not in what he had achieved, but in the simple act of loving Isabella. The landscape around him mirrored this transformation. Snowdrifts softened, and tiny buds began to appear on the branches of the trees that bordered his home. The forest trails they had once walked in winter's silence now echoed with the first notes of birdsong, and the earth, damp and rich, seemed to welcome the change with open arms. Gabriel found himself venturing outdoors more often, drawn not just by the season's renewal, but by the thought of sharing these small, precious moments with her, of inviting Isabella to walk by his side through the unfolding beauty of the season. Isabella, too, felt this shift, though her heart held a quiet apprehension she could not entirely dispel. Her love for Gabriel had grown deeper than she had anticipated, and while she felt the boundlessness of it, she was also acutely aware of the complexities they faced. There were times when she felt herself holding back, cautious of the implications of a love that defied the conventions and expectations of those around them. She worried about the whispers that might follow, the judgments that others might pass upon them. But when she was with him, all those fears seemed to fade into insignificance, replaced by the steady certainty of his presence beside her. Her love for him was as constant as the changing seasons, a steady warmth that filled her heart and lent strength to her steps. She cherished the moments they spent together, savoring the quiet intimacy that had become the foundation of their bond. With him, she felt a peace she had not known before, a sense of belonging that transcended all else. And so, despite her reservations, she allowed herself to trust in the quiet promises they had made to each other, trusting that their love would be enough to carry them through whatever challenges might come. As the days grew longer and the sun cast its gentle warmth over the landscape, Gabriel and Isabella fell into a new rhythm. They spent their afternoons wandering through fields that had begun to show the first signs of life, their footsteps leaving faint imprints in the softened earth. They would pause to admire the clusters of wildflowers that had begun to bloom along the edges of the path, delicate petals unfurling in shades of violet and gold, their colors vibrant against the still bare branches of the trees above. Gabriel would often stop to pick a single flower, carefully placing it in Isabella's hand as a quiet offering, a silent symbol of his devotion. Each flower held within it a world of meaning, a testament to the love that had blossomed between them. Isabella, in turn, would press the flower between the pages of a small notebook she carried, preserving each one as a reminder of the promises they had made to each other. It was their unspoken ritual, a shared act that required no words but held a depth of meaning that only they understood. As they walked together, Isabella often found herself reflecting on the future, on the life she imagined with Gabriel, a life filled with quiet moments and shared understanding. She knew there would be challenges, that their love would be tested in ways she could not yet foresee, but she felt a quiet confidence that, together, they could weather any storm. The strength of their bond lay not in grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but in the steady, unwavering support they offered each other, in the trust that had grown between them like roots reaching deep into the soil. Gabriel, too, felt a sense of peace as he walked beside her, a contentment that came not from the absence of challenges, but from the knowledge that he would face them with her by his side. He knew the path they had chosen was not an easy one, that their love would be met with skepticism and perhaps even resistance. But he felt a quiet resolve, a determination to protect the love they had built together, to stand by her through whatever trials might come. In her presence, he felt a strength he had not known before, a conviction that, despite the differences in their ages, despite the divergent paths their lives had taken, they were meant to be together. Their love was a quiet force, a presence that required no validation or approval, a bond that existed beyond the boundaries of time and circumstance. It was a love that defied definition, a love that thrived not in spite of their differences, but because of them. They were two souls who had found each other against all odds, drawn together by a force that neither could fully explain, but both had come to trust. And in that trust, They found a freedom that was as boundless as the love they shared. As spring unfolded in all its beauty, Gabriel and Isabella continued to walk together, their hearts as open as the fields around them, their love as constant as the steady rhythm of their steps. They did not need words to express the depth of their feelings, for their love spoke in the language of silence, in the unspoken promises they had made to each other, in the quiet certainty that they would face whatever lay ahead together. And as they walked, the world around them seemed to recognize their love, honoring it with each new blossom, with each gentle breeze, with the steady warmth of the sun that bathed their path in light. They walked through the world as though it were their own, their love a quiet presence that filled the space between them, a love that required no explanation, no validation, no justification. It was a love that simply was, a love that had been waiting for them to find it, a love that would endure beyond the changing seasons, beyond the challenges they would face, a love that would carry them through the years with the quiet strength of a promise made in silence. Chapter 9. The Unwritten Script. As summer stretched its golden arms across the horizon, filling the world with warmth and light, Gabriel and Isabella found themselves caught between the fleeting beauty of the season and the heavy, unspoken truths that hung between them. Their love, once simple and uncomplicated, was now beginning to feel the weight of time, a force that neither could ignore, though neither fully understood it. Gabriel felt it first, the subtle change in their days, the delicate shift in the air around them that hinted at something unspoken but undeniable. He had always measured his life by the rhythm of its seasons, by the tasks that needed to be done, by the accomplishments that filled the years. But with Isabella, he had learned to see the world differently. Her presence had been a light in the shadows, an illumination that revealed the beauty in the ordinary. Yet, even the warmth of her love couldn't fully shield him from the growing awareness of their differences, the years between them, the paths that had led them to this moment, and the fact that they could not reverse the course of time. Isabella, too, felt it in the quiet moments that seemed to stretch endlessly, as though time itself was both an ally and an adversary. She found herself often watching Gabriel, her gaze lingering on the way his hair had begun to thin at the temples, how the lines on his face deepened when he smiled. She had never been one to pay much attention to age, until now. There was something about the passage of time that seemed to make everything more precious, more fragile. She feared the inevitable, though she did not speak of it. She feared that time would take Gabriel from her before they had had a chance to fully live out their love, before they had truly experienced all the moments they dreamed of together. Despite her quiet worries, Isabella could not shake the deep sense of peace that had settled in her heart. Every moment with Gabriel was a treasure, each one imbued with a sense of urgency and importance. Time, she realized, had become both her greatest enemy and her greatest teacher. It reminded her of the fleeting nature of all things, yet it also taught her to appreciate the present, to cherish the love she shared with Gabriel, and to hold on to the quiet beauty of their bond. In the passage of time, there was a kind of grace that she could not explain, an understanding that what mattered most was not the years behind them or the ones ahead, but the love they held in the here and now. Their days together seemed to speed by with an alarming swiftness. Mornings slipped into afternoons, afternoons bled into evenings, and evenings blurred into nights. The world around them seemed to move faster, as though the passage of time was a current that swept them along, forcing them to relinquish their grasp on the past and surrender to the inevitable march toward the future. Gabriel, who had once prided himself on his ability to control his life, now found himself powerless in the face of this inexorable force. He had always lived with a sense of purpose, a plan, a structure, but time had a way of unraveling all that. And in this unraveling, he had come to understand that there were some things he could never control, no matter how hard he tried. Isabella, too, grappled with the knowledge that their love could not exist outside the constraints of time. She watched as the world around them continued to change, as the flowers bloomed and faded, as the days grew shorter and the nights longer. It was as if time was a canvas on which their love was painted, a fleeting masterpiece that would eventually fade with the passing seasons. Yet, in each moment, Isabella found herself clinging to the beauty of what they shared. She wanted to believe that their love could transcend time, that it could somehow escape the inevitable erosion of years. But in her quieter moments, when the world was still and the weight of reality pressed down on her, she feared she might be holding onto something that could never last. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden light over the land, Gabriel took Isabella's hand and led her down the familiar path that wound through the fields. The earth beneath their feet was warm, and the air smelled of summer's perfume, the scent of grass, of earth, of flowers in full bloom. They walked in silence, their footsteps the only sound as they moved together through the tall grasses. The sky above them was a deep shade of blue, its vastness a reminder of how small they were in the grand scheme of things, how insignificant their lives seemed against the backdrop of eternity. Yet, in that moment, nothing seemed more important than the love they shared. They paused at a small grove of trees where the shade offered them relief from the sun's heat. The branches swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. Gabriel sat down beneath the shade of an oak tree, his back against the rough bark, and Isabella joined him, sitting beside him in the quiet peace of the afternoon. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a moment, there was no past, no future, only the present, the steady beating of their hearts, the warmth of the sun on their skin, the peace that seemed to settle over them like a blanket. Gabriel closed his eyes, allowing himself to be fully present in the moment, to embrace the stillness that surrounded them. It was in these small, silent moments that he found his true connection to Isabella, a bond that went beyond words, beyond the constraints of time. In her presence, he could let go of his fears, his anxieties, his sense of urgency. Here, beneath the shade of the trees, in the warmth of her love, he felt time slow, felt the world fall away, leaving only the two of them in this sacred space. But even in this peaceful solitude, there was a lingering awareness of the weight of time. Gabriel's mind wandered, and he wondered how long they would have together, how many more moments like this they would share before time, in its relentless march, would claim its toll. Would they grow old together, side by side, or would the years come between them, creating a distance that could not be bridged? The thought lingered, a shadow in the back of his mind, but he pushed it away, choosing instead to focus on the quiet beauty of the moment. Chapter 9. The Unwritten Script. As summer stretched its golden arms across the horizon, filling the world with warmth and light, Gabriel and Isabella found themselves caught between the fleeting beauty of the season and the heavy, unspoken truths that hung between them. Their love, once simple and uncomplicated, was now beginning to feel the weight of time, a force that neither could ignore, though neither fully understood it. Gabriel felt it first, the subtle change in their days, the delicate shift in the air around them that hinted at something unspoken but undeniable. He had always measured his life by the rhythm of its seasons, by the tasks that needed to be done, by the accomplishments that filled the years. But with Isabella, he had learned to see the world differently. Her presence had been a light in the shadows, an illumination that revealed the beauty in the ordinary. Yet, even the warmth of her love couldn't fully shield him from the growing awareness of their differences, the years between them, the paths that had led them to this moment, and the fact that they could not reverse the course of time. Isabella, too, felt it in the quiet moments that seemed to stretch endlessly, as though time itself was both an ally and an adversary. She found herself often watching Gabriel, her gaze lingering on the way his hair had begun to thin at the temples, how the lines on his face deepened when he smiled. She had never been one to pay much attention to age, until now. There was something about the passage of time that seemed to make everything more precious, more fragile. She feared the inevitable, though she did not speak of it. She feared that time would take Gabriel from her before they had had a chance to fully live out their love, before they had truly experienced all the moments they dreamed of together. Despite her quiet worries, Isabella could not shake the deep sense of peace that had settled in her heart. Every moment with Gabriel was a treasure, each one imbued with a sense of urgency and importance. Time, she realized, had become both her greatest enemy and her greatest teacher. It reminded her of the fleeting nature of all things, yet it also taught her to appreciate the present, to cherish the love she shared with Gabriel, and to hold on to the quiet beauty of their bond. In the passage of time, there was a kind of grace that she could not explain, an understanding that what mattered most was not the years behind them or the ones ahead, but the love they held in the here and now. Their days together seemed to speed by with an alarming swiftness. Mornings slipped into afternoons, afternoons bled into evenings, and evenings blurred into nights. The world around them seemed to move faster, as though the passage of time was a current that swept them along, forcing them to relinquish their grasp on the past and surrender to the inevitable march toward the future. Gabriel, who had once prided himself on his ability to control his life, now found himself powerless in the face of this inexorable force. He had always lived with a sense of purpose, a plan, a structure, but time had a way of unraveling all that. And in this unraveling, he had come to understand that there were some things he could never control, no matter how hard he tried. Isabella, too, grappled with the knowledge that their love could not exist outside the constraints of time. She watched as the world around them continued to change, as the flowers bloomed and faded, as the days grew shorter and the nights longer. It was as if time was a canvas on which their love was painted, a fleeting masterpiece that would eventually fade with the passing seasons. Yet, in each moment, Isabella found herself clinging to the beauty of what they shared. She wanted to believe that their love could transcend time, that it could somehow escape the inevitable erosion of years. But in her quieter moments, when the world was still and the weight of reality pressed down on her, she feared she might be holding on to something that could never last. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden light over the land, Gabriel took Isabella's hand and led her down the familiar path that wound through the fields. The earth beneath their feet was warm, and the air smelled of summer's perfume, the scent of grass, of earth, of flowers in full bloom. They walked in silence, their footsteps the only sound as they moved together through the tall grasses. The sky above them was a deep shade of blue, its vastness a reminder of how small they were in the grand scheme of things, how insignificant their lives seemed against the backdrop of eternity. Yet, in that moment, nothing seemed more important than the love they shared. They paused at a small grove of trees where the shade offered them relief from the sun's heat. The branches swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. Gabriel sat down beneath the shade of an oak tree, his back against the rough bark, and Isabella joined him, sitting beside him in the quiet peace of the afternoon. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a moment, there was no past, no future, only the present, the steady beating of their hearts, the warmth of the sun on their skin, the peace that seemed to settle over them like a blanket. Gabriel closed his eyes, allowing himself to be fully present in the moment, to embrace the stillness that surrounded them. It was in these small, silent moments that he found his true connection to Isabella, a bond that went beyond words, beyond the constraints of time. In her presence, he could let go of his fears, his anxieties, his sense of urgency. Here, beneath the shade of the trees, in the warmth of her love, He felt time slow, felt the world fall away, leaving only the two of them in this sacred space. But even in this peaceful solitude, there was a lingering awareness of the weight of time. Gabriel's mind wandered, and he wondered how long they would have together. How many more moments like this they would share before time, in its relentless march, would claim its toll. Would they grow old together, side by side, or would the years come between them, creating a distance that could not be bridged? The thought lingered, a shadow in the back of his mind, but he pushed it away, choosing instead to focus on the quiet beauty of the moment. Isabella, too, felt the quiet tension of time stretching around them. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, grounding herself in the present. She didn't want to think about the future, didn't want to dwell on the fear of what might come. She wanted to hold on to the now, to savor the love they shared, to let it fill her in a way that nothing else ever could. For in these moments, there was no room for doubt, no space for the worries that threatened to intrude. There was only the love between them, strong and unwavering, a love that, for all its complexities, was as pure and real as the earth beneath their feet. They sat together in the quiet of the grove, the sun sinking lower in the sky, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The world around them faded into the background, and all that remained was their love, as vast and timeless as the sky above them. Chapter 10. Lessons from a Different Era. The days drifted into a quiet melancholy, as though the universe itself had taken a deep breath and held it, waiting for something to shift, for something to change. Gabriel and Isabella, in the rhythm of their shared existence, began to feel the subtle pull of something deeper, an unspoken realization that the harmony they had cultivated, the love they had grown into, was not as secure as they had once believed. Time, with its insistent, unyielding march, had begun to stir something inside them, something that neither could name, but both felt profoundly. Gabriel watched the subtle shifts in Isabella, the small changes that seemed imperceptible to others but were so clear to him. There were the quiet pauses when her smile faded too quickly, the brief silences that stretched longer than they should, the way her eyes lingered on distant places, lost in thought. He could feel the weight of it all, the invisible thread that connected their hearts and yet threatened to unravel under the strain of time's relentless passage. He couldn't explain it, but there was a growing distance between them, a distance that had nothing to do with physical space, but everything to do with something far more intangible. It was as if a shadow had fallen between them, one that neither could banish, no matter how hard they tried. Isabella, too, felt the change, but she could not grasp it fully. Her love for Gabriel had only deepened with time, yet the creeping sense of something slipping away, something fragile and fleeting, had begun to haunt her. The world around them continued to turn with its usual haste, while within her, there was a growing disquiet, a tension that tightened in her chest every time she thought about their future. She could not escape the thought that their time together, no matter how perfect, no matter how pure, was bound by an invisible expiration date. She had always been aware of the years between them, but now, more than ever, she felt their weight pressing down on her, growing heavier with every passing day. The evenings became the hardest, when the day's heat faded into the coolness of dusk. It was during those moments, as the sky deepened into shades of lavender and indigo, that Gabriel found himself lost in thought, staring out over the horizon, the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. He would sit on the edge of the porch, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers lightly tapping a rhythm only he could hear. Isabella would join him there, her presence like a balm to his restless mind, but even in the comfort of her closeness, the shadow that loomed between them was impossible to ignore. It hovered, just beyond reach, a silent observer of their every word, every glance, every touch. Their love had always felt so natural, so right, but now it seemed as though it was teetering on the edge of something they couldn't name. Gabriel wanted to reach out, to say something, to pull her closer and tell her that everything would be fine, that they had forever ahead of them. But there was a truth he could not avoid. There were no guarantees in love, and time was the cruelest reminder of that fact. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of orange, Gabriel walked through the familiar garden, his hands brushing the leaves of the plants they had tended to together. It was a small, humble place, but it had become a sanctuary for them, a space where they had shared their hopes and dreams, their fears and regrets. It was here that Gabriel had first realized the depth of his feelings for Isabella, and here that he had come to terms with the quiet, unspoken truth that their love was both a gift and a fleeting illusion. He paused by a rose bush, its blossoms still vibrant despite the season's changes, and allowed himself a moment to reflect. Isabella had always been the one to care for the garden. It had been her sanctuary as much as his, a place where she could let go of the weight of the world and simply exist in the presence of the earth. She understood the plants in a way that Gabriel never could, how they responded to light, to water, to touch, and she had poured her heart into their care. Yet now, as she walked through the garden in the evening light, she too felt the emptiness that lingered there. The roses, once so full of life, now seemed to fade a little faster with each passing day. The air smelled of earth and flowers, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible undertone of decay, a reminder that everything, no matter how beautiful, was subject to time's decay. As she wandered through the rows of plants, Isabella came upon the small wooden bench where they had once sat together, laughing under the stars. She sank down onto the bench, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her as she gazed out over the garden. She felt an ache in her chest, a longing for something she couldn't quite grasp. She loved Gabriel more than she had ever loved anyone, more than she had ever thought it possible to love, but the knowledge that time was not on their side gnawed at her. It was a feeling she could never escape, no matter how hard she tried to push it away. She had seen the signs in Gabriel, the same restlessness that had taken root in her own heart, and it filled her with an inexplicable sadness. The next morning, Gabriel woke early, the sunlight filtering through the curtains and casting soft patterns across the floor. The air was cooler than it had been in weeks, and the sky outside was a pale blue, unmarred by clouds. He rose from bed, his body stiff from sleep, and made his way to the kitchen, where the kettle sat quietly on the stove. As he prepared their morning tea, he thought again of the garden, of the shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should, of the weight that had settled between him and Isabella. He knew that there was something he needed to say, something that had been building in him for days, but the words eluded him, slipping through his mind like water through his fingers. Isabella, already awake, appeared in the doorway, her figure a silhouette against the morning light. She smiled at him, a smile that seemed both tender and bittersweet, and he returned the gesture, though something in his heart twisted at the sight. They had always shared these mornings together, these small, ordinary moments that felt more significant than anything else in the world. Yet now, even the simplicity of their routine seemed laden with a heaviness they could neither deny nor escape. They sat together at the table, their teacups resting between them like fragile vessels holding the weight of everything unsaid. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting golden light over the world, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfect again. But Gabriel could not shake the feeling that something was slipping away, that the moment they had been living in was fading, just like the light outside their window. Chapter 11. Ripples in Still Waters. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields, but the warmth of the day no longer felt comforting. It was as if the heat had dissipated into something heavier, something oppressive that lingered in the air, pressing down on everything beneath it. Gabriel and Isabella, both aware of the silence between them, carried that weight silently. The days had become a blur, with the same gentle rhythm of their shared routines. But something in the atmosphere had shifted, a quiet undercurrent of tension that neither could ignore, yet neither dared to address. For weeks, the change had been subtle, so small that it could almost be overlooked. But now, in the quiet moments of reflection, Gabriel found himself unable to ignore it any longer. Time, as he had once imagined it, had been a distant, abstract thing. Something that passed in the background of their lives, like the turning of the seasons, inevitable yet unnoticed. But now, it felt like something tangible, a presence that encroached on them, always there, reminding them that it would not be denied. Each day, as he moved through their home, Gabriel could feel time moving with him, whispering in his ear, pressing against his chest, making him aware of every passing second. He had grown used to the ticking of the clock, to the subtle reminder of mortality that it provided, but now it felt more like a countdown, an invisible timer measuring the days that they had left. Every smile from Isabella, every shared glance, was suddenly laden with an unspoken urgency. He felt himself watching her more closely now, studying the lines of her face, the way her eyes held secrets that he was only beginning to understand. Isabella, too, had begun to notice the passage of time in a way she had never considered before. She had always known that life moved forward, that everything was constantly in flux, but now, each day felt like a fragile gift, one that she could not take for granted. Her gaze lingered on Gabriel as he worked in the garden or sat quietly by the window, and she found herself wondering if he felt the same unease that had settled deep within her heart. The weight of their love, so beautiful and rare, was now tainted by a quiet awareness of the inevitable. She couldn't push the thought away, no matter how hard she tried. She loved him deeply, completely, but the years that stretched between them seemed to stretch even further now, each one a reminder that they were running out of time. The garden, which had once been a place of solace for them, now felt different. The flowers they had planted together seemed to bow under the weight of their own existence, their petals curling inward as if trying to protect themselves from something they couldn't understand. Gabriel tended to the plants with his usual care, but there was a sense of distance in his movements, a hesitation in the way his hands brushed against the leaves. Isabella, too, wandered through the garden in the early morning, but the sight of the blooming roses now filled her with a strange sorrow. She couldn't shake the feeling that something precious was slipping away, and that no matter how hard they tried, there was nothing they could do to stop it. The house, which had once been their sanctuary, now felt like a silent observer of their unspoken fears. The rooms, filled with the memories of their laughter and love, seemed to echo with an emptiness that neither of them could explain. The walls that had once held the warmth of their voices now seemed to close in on them, pressing against them in a way that felt suffocating. Gabriel would sit by the fire in the evenings, watching the flames dance and flicker, but there was no comfort in it anymore. The fire, once a symbol of their connection, now felt like a reminder of the heat that had long since begun to fade. Isabella, too, found herself staring into the fire, her thoughts drifting away from the present moment. She had always been able to find peace in the small things, the sound of the wind outside, the rustling of the leaves, the soft glow of the candles. But now, even these familiar comforts felt distant, like echoes from another time. She had always believed that love, true love, could conquer anything, that it was the one constant in a world of change. But now, she wondered if even love could withstand the weight of time. As the days passed, Gabriel and Isabella found themselves growing more distant, not in the way that lovers often do when they are no longer in love, but in a way that seemed tied to something much larger than their individual desires. They were both aware of the ticking clock, the invisible hand that seemed to push them forward with relentless force. They no longer spoke of their future together, no longer dreamed of what it would be like to grow old side by side. Instead, they moved through each day as though it was the last, savoring the moments they had left without acknowledging the deep ache that accompanied every touch, every shared silence. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, Gabriel felt the weight of time pressing down on him once more. The stillness of the night, the cool air brushing against his skin, only served to intensify the feeling that they were standing at the edge of something they couldn't fully comprehend. The stars, which had once seemed so distant, now felt like a symbol of something beyond their reach. Gabriel's hand, resting beside Isabella's, trembled ever so slightly, the only outward sign of the fear that gripped his heart. Isabella, sensing the shift in the air, turned her gaze toward him. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his in a gesture that was both tender and desperate. They had always found solace in each other's presence, but tonight, the silence between them felt heavier than ever. She wanted to speak, to ask him what he was thinking, to tell him that they would be fine, that they could face anything together. But the words refused to come. Instead, she simply sat there, her hand in his, the coolness of the evening settling over them like a blanket, comforting yet suffocating. As the night deepened, the world around them seemed to fade into the background. The chirping of the crickets, the rustling of the leaves in the trees, all became distant sounds, as though they were floating in a dream. Gabriel and Isabella remained there, side by side, their thoughts swirling in the quiet darkness. Time, for the first time, seemed to be something they couldn't control, something they couldn't outrun. They had spent so long believing that their love would conquer all, that it was strong enough to transcend any obstacle. But now, they were forced to confront the truth, that even love could not halt the passage of time. And so, in the stillness of that evening, as the stars watched silently above them, Gabriel and Isabella sat together, knowing that the weight of time would not allow them to remain in this moment forever. Yet, as they held each other in the quiet embrace of the night, there was a strange sense of peace, a fleeting, fragile peace that whispered of the love they had shared and the love they would always carry in their hearts. Chapter 12. The Cost of Belonging. The days had begun to blur into one another, each passing with a strange, fluid quality that Gabriel and Isabella could neither understand nor explain. Time, once a steady force that could be measured in the ticking of clocks and the rising and setting of the sun, now felt as though it had slipped into a new rhythm, one that neither of them could quite grasp. The world around them seemed unchanged, yet everything was subtly shifting, as if something beneath the surface was moving, too quiet for them to hear, but undeniable in its presence. Gabriel had always been a man of routine, someone who found comfort in the familiar, in the things that didn't change. He had always believed that in the steadiness of his life, he could find meaning. But now, each moment felt fragile, as though it could break apart at any given second. There were mornings when he woke, confused by the sound of the wind or the chirp of birds outside his window, and he would lie there, for a moment, disoriented, unsure of where he was. Isabella, too, felt it, the creeping unease, the quiet knowledge that something was slipping away, though neither of them could put it into words. Their home, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt too vast, its walls too empty. The rooms they had shared for so many years now echoed with a silence that was both comforting and unnerving. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees outside, felt amplified, as though the house itself was breathing along with them, holding its breath in anticipation of something they could not see. Isabella found herself wandering through the house more often, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the furniture, the rough edges of the bookshelves, as if trying to find some connection to the past. She would stand before the windows, staring out at the garden, and wonder how many seasons had passed, how many moments had been lost to the quiet march of time. The flowers in the garden, once so bright, so full of life, now appeared faded, their colors muted by the slow passage of time. The roses that Gabriel had planted with such care had withered, their petals curling inward, as if trying to hold on to something they could no longer grasp. The once vibrant blooms seemed to mirror the state of their relationship, a delicate thing, caught between the beauty of the past and the inevitable decay of time. Isabella would tend to the garden, her hands gently touching the flowers, trying to coax them back to life. But even she knew that there was nothing she could do to stop the inevitable. The flowers, like everything else in their lives, were fading, slipping away, and there was nothing to be done but accept it. At night, when the house was dark and still, Gabriel would sit by the window, staring out at the stars, and wonder if he could have done things differently. There were moments, brief flashes of clarity, when he would see himself as a younger man, full of ambition and promise, standing at the edge of the world with a future laid out before him. He had never imagined that his life would take this turn, that love, something he had once believed to be eternal, could fade in the same way that everything else did. The years had passed, and he had never truly understood how quickly they would slip through his fingers, how little control he would have over their passage. He thought of Isabella often during these moments of quiet reflection. How, in the beginning, she had been so full of life, so full of energy, that he had believed she would never change. She had been his anchor, his constant, and he had clung to her, certain that nothing would ever pull them apart. But now, he found himself wondering if he had been wrong. The changes were so subtle, so small, but they were undeniable. Isabella had grown quieter over the years, her once vibrant eyes now distant, her smile less frequent. The sparkle that had once defined her presence now seemed dulled, as though the years had stolen it away. Isabella, for her part, had begun to feel the weight of the passing days in a way that she hadn't before. She had always been someone who reveled in the beauty of the present moment, someone who saw the joy in the simple things. But now, even the simplest things felt burdened by the knowledge of time's relentless march. She would find herself lost in thought, staring at the cracks in the ceiling or the way the sunlight filtered through the curtains, and she would feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. It was as though she was standing at the edge of a precipice, and no matter how hard she tried, she could not stop herself from looking over the edge. There were times when she wished that she could turn back, that she could reclaim the years that had slipped away, but deep down, she knew that was impossible. The past was gone, and no matter how much she longed for it, it would never return. She could only look forward, but the future was shrouded in uncertainty, and the fear of what was to come weighed on her heart. The quiet between them had grown thicker, more palpable. At times, it felt as though they were two people drifting farther apart, tethered together only by the faintest thread of connection. Gabriel and Isabella no longer spoke of their dreams for the future, no longer spoke of the life they had once imagined for themselves. Instead, they moved through the days in a quiet, resigned rhythm, both trying, in their own ways, to hold on to what remained. It was in these moments of silence, when the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future seemed too much to bear, that Gabriel would find himself thinking of the times they had shared, of the laughter, the passion, the warmth. He would think back to their first meeting, to the moments when their love had felt like an unbreakable bond, a force that would endure anything. But those memories, once so vivid, had begun to blur, like a painting that had been exposed to too much light. And Isabella, too, thought back to those days, to the early moments when everything had seemed so possible. She remembered the way he had looked at her, the way his hands had trembled when he held hers for the first time. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet, in some ways, it felt as if it had happened only yesterday. But now, she knew that time had changed them both, that it had altered the landscape of their lives in ways they could not reverse. The sound of the wind outside, the rustling of the leaves in the trees, had become their only constant companions. Each gust of wind seemed to carry away a little piece of their past, a little piece of the love they had shared. Gabriel would close his eyes at night, listening to the wind, and for a brief moment, he would feel as though he were standing on the edge of everything that had come before, watching it slip away, leaving him with only the echoes of what once was. In the stillness of the night, Gabriel and Isabella lay beside one another, their hearts beating in the same rhythm, but the space between them felt vast. There was a silence that stretched out before them, a silence that seemed to swallow everything in its path. It was the silence of time, the silence of things fading away, the silence of love being carried away on the wind. Chapter 13. In the absence of doubt. The days had become a hazy blur, their edges softened by the passage of time and the quiet undercurrent of uncertainty that flowed through everything. The seasons shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, and Gabriel and Isabella continued to move through their lives, their footsteps echoing softly in the spaces between them. There was a sense of heaviness that hung in the air, a weight that neither of them could quite place, but which both felt in their bones. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something neither of them could name. Isabella spent her mornings walking in the garden, her fingers brushing the edges of the flowers as if trying to rekindle something lost. The once thriving plants had begun to wilt, their leaves curling inward, as if surrendering to the inevitability of the passing days. The roses that Gabriel had planted so carefully were now faded, their petals scattered across the ground like delicate fragments of a once beautiful dream. Isabella would kneel beside them, her hands trembling as she gently picked up the fallen petals, but she knew that there was nothing she could do to stop the inevitable. The garden, like their lives, was fading, its beauty slipping away with the seasons. She thought of the days when the garden had been full of life, when the flowers had bloomed with wild abandon, their colors vibrant and bold. It seemed a lifetime ago, a distant memory that was slipping further away with each passing day. She had once believed that love, like the garden, could be tended and nurtured, that with enough care and attention, it could withstand the tests of time. But now, as she looked at the withered flowers, she wondered if she had been wrong. Was love truly something that could endure, or was it destined to fade, just like everything else? As she stood in the garden, lost in thought, Gabriel watched her from the window. He had always admired the way she moved through the world, with such grace and quiet strength. But now he saw her differently. There was a sadness in her eyes, a weariness that he could no longer ignore. It was as though she had become a shadow of herself, the woman he had once known slipping further and further away with each passing day. He had spent so many years believing that their love would carry them through anything, that no matter what came their way, they would always have each other. But now, as he watched her in the garden, he wondered if he had been wrong. Could love truly withstand the test of time, or was it destined to fade, like the flowers she so carefully tended? He turned away from the window, his heart heavy with a quiet, painful knowledge. The weight of tomorrow seemed to hang over him, a burden that he could not escape. Each day that passed felt like a countdown, the clock ticking steadily towards something he could not control. It was as though the future had become a shadow, looming over them, casting a pall over everything they once held dear. In the silence of their home, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. It was a sound that had once been comforting, a steady reminder of time's passage, but now it felt like an intrusion. Each tick seemed to echo louder in the empty spaces between them, each one a reminder that time was slipping away. Gabriel could feel it in his chest, the pressure building, the weight of the years that had passed and the years that were yet to come. Isabella, too, felt the pressure of time, though she could not name it. She had always been someone who believed in living in the moment, in cherishing the fleeting beauty of each day. But now, she found herself caught in the undertow of time, swept along by its currents, unable to stop the inevitable. There were moments when she would look at Gabriel, and the weight of their shared history would press down on her, as if the years they had spent together were both a blessing and a curse. They had built a life together, a life filled with memories, but those memories had begun to feel distant, like fragments of a dream. She wondered, too, about the future. What would it hold for them? Would they continue to drift through the days, held together by nothing more than the quiet comfort of routine? Or would the inevitable changes that had begun to take root in their lives pull them further apart, until they were nothing more than strangers, sharing the same space but living in different worlds? As the days passed, Gabriel found himself retreating further into himself, withdrawing into the quiet corners of his mind where he could pretend that nothing had changed. He spent long hours in his study, poring over books and papers, as if immersing himself in the world of knowledge could protect him from the reality that loomed outside his door. But no matter how deeply he buried himself in his work, the feeling of impending loss never left him. It was as if the future was a heavy weight pressing down on him, and no amount of distraction could lighten it. Isabella, in contrast, seemed to have withdrawn into herself as well, though in a different way. She spent her days walking through the house, touching the things they had accumulated together, the photographs, the trinkets, the furniture, and trying to make sense of it all. There were moments when she would find herself staring at something for an uncomfortable amount of time, as if the object had some deeper meaning that she could not quite understand. She found herself searching for answers in the small details of their life together, as though the meaning of everything could be found in the way Gabriel's coat hung on the back of a chair, or the way the light fell across the kitchen table at sunset. In the evenings, they would sit together in the living room, the silence between them growing thicker with each passing hour. Gabriel would stare into the fire, lost in his thoughts, while Isabella would watch the shadows dance on the walls, feeling the weight of their years pressing down on her. It was as though they were both waiting for something, waiting for the world to change, or for something to shift, or for the past to come rushing back to them, bringing with it a sense of purpose and clarity. But nothing came. The moments stretched on, one after another, each one blending into the next, until the days no longer had any distinction. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, Gabriel stood by the window, looking out at the horizon. The world outside seemed still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the sky tinged with the soft hues of dusk. It was a beautiful sight, but to Gabriel, it felt distant, like something he could no longer touch. He had always believed that the world was full of endless possibilities, but now, as he looked out at the fading light, he wondered if the world had somehow changed, if the possibilities had all been used up, leaving nothing but the slow, inevitable march of time. And Isabella, sitting in the chair behind him, watched him from the corner of her eye, feeling the weight of tomorrow bearing down on both of them. She, too, could not escape the pull of time, could not stop the drift that had begun between them. There was a quiet resignation in the air now, a sense that they were both waiting for something to happen, but knowing that it would not come, at least not in the way they had hoped. The past was behind them, and the future, though still uncertain, loomed large, casting its long shadow over them both. And so they sat, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their own private fears, the weight of tomorrow heavy in the silence between them. Chapter 14. Against the Tide of Days. The world seemed to be shifting beneath Gabriel and Isabella's feet. A quiet tremor beneath the surface that they could both feel but could not quite understand. It was as if everything around them, every routine, every familiar moment, was beginning to unravel in slow motion, and neither of them knew how to stop it. They moved through their days as though in a dream, their bodies performing the motions of life while their minds remained caught somewhere just beyond their reach, tethered to an uncertainty they could neither embrace nor escape. Gabriel, once so certain of the path his life had taken, now felt the ground beneath him growing softer, more unstable. He had spent years building a life that felt solid, anchored in place, but now he could sense the cracks in the foundation. It was a slow realization, one that crept up on him in the quiet moments when he wasn't expecting it. He would look at Isabella, her face worn with the quiet sadness that had begun to define her, and wonder if they had already crossed the point of no return. It was as though their love, once so vibrant, so full of promise, had been dimmed by the weight of time, by the distance that had grown between them in ways that were too subtle to notice until now. Isabella, too, had begun to feel the shift in the air. The house, which had once been a sanctuary, now seemed to echo with the absence of something she could not quite define. There were mornings when she would wake up, her mind drifting between dreams and reality, and she would find herself wondering if everything they had built had already slipped away in small, unnoticed ways. It was as though they were both moving through their days like shadows of themselves, the people they once were slipping away with each tick of the clock. There were moments when she would stand in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where the two of them had shared so many meals, so many quiet conversations. The silence felt louder now, somehow, as though it were pressing in on her from all sides. She had always believed in the beauty of their shared history, the years they had spent building a life together, but now she found herself questioning whether that history had been enough. Was it enough to carry them through this, whatever this was, or had the years of their love simply become a beautiful memory, something to hold on to when everything else seemed to be slipping away? The seasons had begun to change again, the air turning colder as winter approached. The garden outside, once a vibrant reflection of Isabella's care, now stood as a barren landscape, the flowers long gone, the soil turned cold and unyielding. Isabella had stopped tending to it, the weight of her own thoughts making her forget the small joys she had once found in the simple act of nurturing life. The trees that had once borne fruit now stood bare, their branches stretching like outstretched arms into the sky, as if pleading for something that would never come. Gabriel, too, had noticed the change in the garden. He would sit by the window, watching as the wind stirred the bare branches, and he would feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. There was a time when he had believed that love was like the garden, that with enough care, it could be cultivated, could withstand the changes of time. But now, as he watched the leaves fall, he wondered if he had been wrong. Was it possible to tend to something that had already begun to wither? Was love something that could be revived once it had lost its bloom? Or was it destined to fade into nothingness? There were days when he would find himself sitting in the same chair in the living room, staring into the fire, lost in thoughts he could not express. His mind wandered back to the years they had spent together, the memories they had created. There were flashes of laughter, of moments of tenderness, of shared dreams and whispered promises. But those memories now felt like distant echoes, as though they belonged to someone else, to a time and place that no longer existed. It was as if the love they had shared had become a story, one that was slipping further and further away, no matter how hard they tried to hold on to it. Isabella, too, found herself lost in the past, searching for answers in the remnants of their life together. She would walk through the house, touching the objects that had once held meaning for her: photos, trinkets, books. wondering if they had somehow lost their significance. She thought of the life they had built, the love they had shared, and she could not help but wonder if it had all been enough. She could feel the distance between them growing, a quiet but undeniable gap that neither of them knew how to close. The future loomed large, a shadow on the horizon, and she could feel its weight, its uncertainty, pressing in on her with every passing moment. One evening, as the last light of day slipped beneath the horizon, Gabriel sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. He could feel the coldness in the room, a coldness that was not just from the winter air, but from something deeper, something more insidious. It was the coldness of the space between them, the growing distance that neither of them knew how to bridge. He thought of the years they had spent together, of the love they had shared, and he could not escape the feeling that something had shifted. It was as though the love they had once known had been replaced by something quieter, something more distant, and he could not help but wonder if it was too late to turn things around. Isabella entered the room quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the wooden floor. She looked at Gabriel, sitting there in the dim light, and for a moment, she saw him as he once was, strong, confident, full of life. But now, there was something different about him, something she could not name. He was not the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. He was a shadow of that man, a reflection of the person he used to be. And she, too, had changed. She had become someone she did not fully recognize, someone who was lost in the quiet spaces of their shared life. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say, nothing that could be said to undo the weight of what had passed between them. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but the room felt colder than it had before. It was as if time itself had frozen, and they were left standing at the end of something. An era, a chapter, a part of themselves that had already slipped away. Gabriel finally stood and walked to the window, his hands resting on the sill as he looked out at the darkening world. He could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet realization that this was it, that they had come to the end of an era. The love they had once known had changed, and now, as the night descended, it seemed like there was no going back. The past was gone, and the future, though still uncertain, was no longer something they could imagine together. Isabella stood behind him, her eyes closed, feeling the same weight. The future was slipping away, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Chapter 15. The Rebirth of Love. The morning light broke through the heavy clouds, scattering golden rays over the land as though the sky itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The earth, still wet from the overnight rain, shimmered with a quiet renewal, the air crisp and fresh with the promise of something new. Gabriel and Isabella, both feeling the weight of the past days, found themselves standing at the threshold of a new season, both in the world and in their hearts. It was as though time had pressed pause for a moment, giving them both the space they needed to breathe and to think. The house, which had once felt so oppressive with its silence and stillness, now seemed to hold a different kind of energy, a quiet hum that came from within. It was as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale. The atmosphere felt lighter, as though the years of tension and uncertainty had finally begun to loosen their grip. Gabriel looked around the room, his eyes falling on the familiar sights: the worn armchair where he had sat for hours in silence, the fireplace that had been the heart of their home, the paintings that had once seemed to capture moments of joy, now faded with time. It was all so familiar, yet so different now. He could feel the change, the shift that had taken place, but he wasn't sure yet how to name it. Isabella, standing by the window, gazed out at the garden, her thoughts as scattered as the leaves that fluttered to the ground in the cool breeze. There was a sense of stillness in her that she had not felt in a long time. Her heart, once heavy with the weight of unspoken words, now felt lighter, almost as though it was beginning to open up again. She had spent so many months, so many years, wondering if they were meant to be, if they could ever find their way back to each other. But now, as the world outside came alive with the promise of spring, she felt a glimmer of hope stir within her. It was as if the deadened parts of her heart, the ones that had grown cold and weary with time, were beginning to awaken. Gabriel stepped closer to her, his presence a quiet reassurance. He didn't need to say anything. There were no words that could explain the way he felt, the way the air around them seemed to change when they were near each other. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers lightly at first, as if testing the waters. It had been so long since they had touched like this, so long since their hands had found each other in such a simple, intimate way. Isabella looked at him, and in that brief moment, there was a shared understanding between them. It wasn't just about the years they had spent together or the challenges they had faced. It was about what they were willing to build from here on out, the future they could create together. The silence between them was no longer oppressive, no longer a weight to bear. It was peaceful, like a deep breath taken after a long, exhausting journey. Gabriel could feel the tension that had once defined their relationship beginning to ebb away, replaced by something softer, more fluid. It was as though they were rediscovering each other, not as they had been, but as they were now. Changed, yes, but still capable of growth, of love, of connection. They stepped outside, the cool morning air greeting them like a long-lost friend. The garden, though still sparse, held signs of life, buds just beginning to form, the first green shoots of spring pushing through the soil. Isabella crouched down by one of the plants, her fingers brushing the earth, feeling the texture beneath her skin. She had not tended to the garden in so long, but now it seemed as though the act of nurturing something small and fragile could be the first step in nurturing herself, in nurturing them. Gabriel stood beside her, his gaze lingering on the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to rise higher in the sky. It was a quiet morning, one that held the promise of change. The past no longer seemed to haunt them in the same way. It was still there, of course, but it no longer felt like a weight that dragged them down. Instead, they began to see it as a part of their story, a chapter that had led them to this point, to this moment of quiet understanding. The future, while still uncertain, no longer seemed so impossible. They were no longer trapped in the past, nor were they clinging to an idealized version of what might have been. They were here, now, in this moment, and that was enough. Isabella stood up slowly, her eyes meeting Gabriel's. There was a depth in her gaze, a softness that hadn't been there before, a quiet assurance that things could still change, still grow, still evolve. Gabriel reached for her again, this time taking her hand fully in his, the warmth of his touch grounding her, reassuring her that they were in this together. For the first time in a long time, Isabella allowed herself to believe that maybe they could rebuild what had been broken. Maybe they could take what they had left, the fragments of their love, and piece them together in a way that would make sense. Gabriel could feel the weight of the decision settle in his chest. He had spent so much of his life thinking that love was something that either existed fully or didn't exist at all. But now, standing here beside Isabella, he understood that love was more complicated than that. It was fragile, it was imperfect, but it was also strong, capable of growing and changing with time. The love they had once known wasn't gone. It had simply transformed. It had been weathered by the storms of their lives, but it was still there, waiting to be rediscovered, waiting to be reborn. The morning passed in a quiet haze, both of them moving through the day with a sense of calm they had not felt in years. The house, the garden, the world outside, they all seemed to belong to them once again, not as the place they had lived in for so long, but as the place they could now grow into. They began to make plans again, small steps at first, replanting the garden, painting the walls, restoring the spaces in their home that had once seemed so full of life. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about creating something new from it, something that could carry them forward. And as the days stretched into weeks, Gabriel and Isabella found themselves looking at each other with new eyes, seeing each other not just for the years they had spent together, but for the possibilities that lay ahead. The weight of time still hung in the air, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a bridge, connecting the past with the future, a reminder of what had been and what could still be. In the end, love was not a perfect thing, nor was it something that could be contained or defined. It was, like the seasons, something that could be lost and found, something that could be reborn. And for Gabriel and Isabella, it was in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the morning, that they discovered what they had always known deep down, that love was not something to be grasped, but something to be lived. And in that living, it could be found again, renewed, and made stronger by the passage of time. Chapter 16. The Quiet Triumph of Time. The air had shifted once again. What had once seemed like an impossible journey now appeared as a path that had always been theirs to walk, a winding trail beneath the boughs of trees that had stood firm through countless seasons, weathering every storm and basking in every sun. Gabriel and Isabella stood at the threshold of something they had spent years waiting for, yet neither of them could quite articulate what it was. It was not a sudden revelation, not an explosion of emotion or grand gesture, but rather a quiet, steady unfolding, a slow bloom in the heart that neither of them could have predicted. The day, like their lives, was moving with deliberate slowness, the sun's rays stretching long across the landscape, casting warm, golden light that seemed to make the earth breathe. The garden had begun to take shape once more, the green shoots rising from the soil like small miracles. The flowers, once forgotten and left to wither, had been replanted with care, their roots now nestled deep in the earth as if they too had been given a second chance. It wasn't just the garden that was reborn. It was everything around them, their home, their life, their love. All of it was being reborn, not in the way of something that had been lost and found, but in the way of something that had been quietly waiting to reveal itself, to settle into its true form. Gabriel had taken to spending his mornings in the garden, his hands working the soil, carefully tending to the flowers and plants that had once seemed so distant. His movements were steady, patient, a reflection of the inner peace he was beginning to cultivate within himself. There was no longer a rush, no longer a frantic search for something that had been lost. Instead, there was only the satisfaction of creation, of nurturing something that would grow slowly and surely, as all things do when given the right care. Isabella, too, found herself drawn to the garden, though she didn't spend quite as much time in the soil. Instead, she would stand at the edge, watching Gabriel with a quiet kind of appreciation, a feeling that had been foreign to her just a few months ago. There was something undeniably grounding about these moments, these simple, everyday acts. Her gaze would often drift over to him, taking in the familiar sight of his hands working the earth, his brow furrowed in concentration, his movements so familiar and yet so new. He was different now, softer somehow. Not the man who had once been caught in the whirlwind of regret and unresolved questions. He had become someone she could see herself with again, someone she could look at and imagine growing old beside. It wasn't the grand gestures or the promises they had made long ago that now mattered. It was the quiet understanding between them, the patience that had replaced the desperation. The house, too, was changing. The walls that had once seemed so cold and indifferent were now filled with warmth. The kind of warmth that comes from living, from breathing, from simply being. Each room, each corner, now held echoes of their efforts, their attempts to rebuild what had been fractured. The painting on the wall, once abandoned, was now filled with bright, vivid colors, a reflection of the vibrancy that was beginning to seep back into their lives. The kitchen, where they had spent countless hours cooking meals that were as much about survival as they were about sustenance, now smelled of fresh herbs and slow-braised dishes. It wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. It was about filling the spaces with meaning, even in the smallest of ways. There were still moments of quiet reflection, of questions that lingered unspoken, but they no longer carried the same weight. Gabriel would sometimes find himself staring out of the window, his gaze drifting over the horizon as though searching for something he couldn't name. It wasn't uncertainty, not anymore. It was a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that the future would come, as it always does, and that all he needed to do was be present for it. To be present for Isabella. To be present for the love they were now cultivating. Isabella, too, had her moments of introspection. She would stand by the window, her hand resting against the glass as her thoughts wandered, sometimes back to the early days of their marriage, when the world had seemed so full of promise, and other times she would find herself thinking about the years in between, the silence that had built up like a wall between them, the distance they had created without even realizing it. But now, as she stood there in the soft glow of the afternoon light, there was no longer any bitterness in her heart. She had come to understand that love was never just a simple thing to hold, but rather something that grew in the most unexpected of ways. It had been wounded, yes, but it had also healed in its own time, its own rhythm. It was no longer about reclaiming what had been lost, but about finding what they could create together now. Their relationship was no longer a fragile thing, built on shaky ground. It was something sturdy, rooted in the same soil that had given life to the garden they tended together. The more time passed, the more they began to understand that love was not something that could be forced or hurried. It had its own pace, its own seasons, and it was only through patience, through commitment to each other, that they would see it flourish once again. As the days turned into weeks, Gabriel and Isabella found themselves more in tune with the rhythm of their days. There were moments of stillness, moments where they simply sat together in the quiet of the evening, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky. There were moments of joy, too, laughter shared over a meal, quiet conversations that drifted into the night, plans made for a future that no longer seemed so distant. The past, while still there, no longer held the same grip over them. They had found a way to move forward, not by erasing it, but by letting it be a part of their story without letting it define them. And then there were the small victories, the moments when Gabriel would catch Isabella smiling at him, a quiet smile that spoke volumes. The moments when Isabella would see Gabriel looking at her with a softness in his eyes, a look that told her everything she needed to know. They were no longer trying to fix what had been broken. They were simply building something new, something that would stand the test of time, something that could grow and evolve with them. In those moments, they understood something that had eluded them for so long. Love, like time, was not something to be controlled or rushed. It was something to be lived, fully and without hesitation. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, Gabriel and Isabella stood side by side, no longer afraid of what the future might bring, but ready to embrace it together. For the first time in a long time, they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together with patience, with hope, and with a love that had endured through all the seasons. Chapter 17. In the hands of tomorrow. Time had woven its intricate tapestry, threading memories of the past and hopes for the future into a complex design. Gabriel and Isabella moved through their days like two pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their place in a world they no longer sought to change, but simply to inhabit. The house, the garden, the quiet moments between them. All of it felt like a still photograph, suspended in time yet filled with the subtle, unnoticed movements of life. It was late afternoon, and the light from the window caught the edges of the old oak table where Gabriel had once sat alone, lost in thought. Now, there was a softness to him, a peace that had settled deep within his bones. The lines on his face, the marks of the years, no longer felt like burdens. Instead, they were a testament to the journey he had made, to the endurance that had carried him through his life's challenges, the pain and joy, the regrets and triumphs. Each wrinkle, each subtle change in his posture, spoke of time well lived, of a man who had learned to accept what had come and embrace what was still to be. Isabella often found herself looking at him now, not with the hurried eyes of the woman she had been years ago, eager for answers, for resolution, for clarity. No, now she saw him with a gaze that acknowledged all he had been through. His age, his experience. It was not something to be feared, but something to be revered. In his presence, she understood that youth was not always an advantage, and age was not always a limitation. His years had taught him the patience to weather storms, and his silence was often more profound than any words could ever be. The days had unfolded slowly, like the petals of a flower revealing their delicate beauty only when the time was right. Gabriel and Isabella no longer rushed through their lives. Instead, they moved with purpose, understanding that there was no finish line, no deadline for the happiness they had now come to share. Their love had not been a sprint but a slow, steady walk, and with every step, they understood more deeply what it meant to be with someone. Not just for the passion that came in fleeting moments, but for the quiet understanding, the shared breaths, the companionship that filled the spaces between the words. The world outside their home continued on, its pulse unaffected by the changes within their walls. The seasons turned with their own rhythm, unhurried and indifferent to the human drama that played out beneath them. There were moments when Isabella would stand in the window, looking out over the familiar landscape, and wonder if she could truly count the number of days that had passed since they had first walked this path together. It seemed like so long ago, and yet, in another way, it felt like it had all just begun. There was something about this stretch of time, this age they had arrived at, that gave the world a different kind of depth. The things that once seemed important, the worries, the fears, the ambitions, now felt almost trivial, replaced by the deep, unspoken knowledge that all that truly mattered was this moment, this life they were living together. The nights were no longer filled with restless tossing and turning, plagued by unanswered questions or the specter of old regrets. They had found a way to be at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because they had learned to accept what was imperfect and still find beauty in it. Gabriel had begun to wake before the sun each morning, his body accustomed to the rhythm of the day. He would stand by the window, the cool morning air filling his lungs, and for a brief moment, he felt entirely present, aware of everything, of nothing, all at once. It was a feeling that had eluded him in his youth, a feeling of stillness and contentment that had only come with the weight of years. Isabella, too, had settled into this new rhythm, finding herself content with less. There were days when she spent hours tending to the garden, losing herself in the work, feeling the earth between her fingers as if it connected her to the very heart of the world. And then there were days when she simply sat beside Gabriel, her hand resting on the arm of his chair, watching the sun as it began its descent, listening to the sounds of the world outside their home. The quiet was no longer unsettling. It was a balm, soothing the frayed edges of the years that had passed, the years that had once seemed so impossible. There was a certain joy in the mundane now, a joy they had not known before. It wasn't in grand gestures or big plans. It was in the simple moments that made up their days. The way the light filtered through the trees in the late afternoon, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchen, the small, quiet smiles they shared when they found themselves looking at each other from across the room. It was these small things, these seemingly insignificant moments, that filled the spaces between the larger milestones of their lives. It was these things that had come to define their relationship, these things that made it real. And yet, there was still a heaviness that Gabriel carried with him. It was not the weight of regret or missed opportunities, but something more complex. It was the weight of time itself. The knowledge that they were not as young as they once were, that the years were not infinite, that their time together, like all things, was finite. This realization did not fill him with fear, but with a quiet sense of gratitude. Every moment was a gift. Every day was a blessing. He no longer looked ahead with anxiety, but with a gentle sense of reverence for the days they had left. Isabella, too, felt the weight of these thoughts, though they were not so much a burden as a reminder. It was the reminder of how precious life was, how fragile love could be, and how every minute they had now was worth cherishing. She had learned not to look back with regret, nor forward with dread, but simply to live in the moment, to savor the time they had, no matter how much or how little was left. And so, as the days continued to pass, Gabriel and Isabella found themselves, not in the grand gestures of youth, but in the quiet, subtle understanding of what it meant to truly be with someone, to be fully present in each other's lives, to accept what had been and embrace what was still to come. They no longer counted the years, for they had come to understand that it was not the number of years that mattered, but the depth of them. The weight of the years had not burdened them. It had made them stronger, more certain of the love they had built together. The sun had dipped below the horizon, the sky now a deep shade of purple. Gabriel stood in the doorway, watching as Isabella moved through the room, her steps light, her movements graceful. They had no need for words, for the silence between them spoke volumes. In that silence, they understood the truth of their journey. That love, in all its forms, was not a fleeting thing. It was a slow, steady burn, a fire that would continue to warm them long after the days had passed. And as the night settled over them, Gabriel and Isabella knew, in their hearts, that no matter what the future held, they had lived a life worth living, a life filled with love, with quiet triumph, and with the enduring, unspoken understanding that time, in the end, was on their side. Chapter 18. Timeless Together. The morning came with a soft hush, the sun casting its golden light across the horizon as though gently pushing the shadows away. The world was still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves stirred by a quiet breeze. Gabriel stood at the window once again, the same place he had stood countless times before, looking out over the land that had become their sanctuary. The vast expanse of fields and trees stretched endlessly before him, like an unspoken promise of all the days that had passed and all those yet to come. But today, there was something different about the light, something that made the air feel lighter, the earth beneath him feel more solid. The house, with its worn walls and comforting stillness, seemed to hum with a life of its own. It had been their refuge for so long now, a place where time had lost its hold, where the chaos of the outside world could not intrude. It had been their anchor, their shelter from the storms of life. And yet, as Gabriel stood there, watching the early morning unfold before him, he felt a sense of release, as though the weight of the years, of all the moments that had defined their journey, was finally lifting. It wasn't a sense of finality, but of something more profound, of a quiet understanding that the time they had spent here, together, had shaped them in ways they had yet to fully realize. Isabella was somewhere behind him, moving through the house with the same graceful ease that had become a part of her, like a constant rhythm to the melody of their lives. Gabriel could feel her presence even without seeing her, like a quiet force that flowed through every room. She had been his companion in ways that went beyond what words could convey, and their shared silence now felt like the truest form of communication they had ever known. The world outside continued its unhurried dance, the birds singing their early morning songs, the trees swaying in the breeze, and the sunlight dappling the earth in patterns of gold. Everything was alive. Everything was moving, yet everything remained still. In that moment, Gabriel realized that the time they had spent together had given him something far greater than he had expected. He had always thought that the years would be the measure of a life lived, but now he understood. It was not the years that defined them. It was the depth of the moments that had filled those years. The weight of age, the weight of time, no longer felt like a burden. It was simply part of the natural order of things. Gabriel had learned to let go of the need to control, to shape, to fix. Time was not an enemy, it was a companion, a quiet guide that helped them navigate the contours of life. And in that realization, Gabriel felt a peace he had never known before. The things that once seemed so urgent, answers, resolutions, the race toward an unknown destination, no longer held any sway over him. He had come to understand that the journey itself was the destination, that the love they had shared, the quiet moments, the small victories, were the true measure of a life well lived. Isabella entered the room, her steps soft but certain, and Gabriel felt her gaze before she spoke. He didn't need to turn around to know that she was there. She had always been able to reach him without words. The room was filled with an undeniable warmth, an energy that was rooted not in anything external, but in the bond they had forged together. Isabella moved to stand beside him, her presence a quiet force. She did not reach for his hand, but the connection between them was stronger than any physical touch could ever be. She, too, had felt it, the shift, the release, the understanding that time was not an enemy, but a partner in their lives. It was something they had come to accept, this slow march toward the inevitable, this dance with the passing of years. But as they stood there, side by side, Gabriel realized that the passing of time had only deepened their connection, had only made their love more resilient, more enduring. The air outside felt fresh, bracing, and for a brief moment, Gabriel allowed himself to think about all the places he had never been, all the roads he had never traveled. There had been a time when he had thought about the future as though it were something that could be controlled, something that could be shaped into a specific outcome. But now, there was only the present, and it was enough. There would be no grand adventures, no journeys to distant lands. Instead, there was this life, this moment, this love. And as Gabriel stood there, gazing out over the horizon, a thought came to him. It was not a thought of longing or regret, but of peace. He realized that the horizon, the boundary between earth and sky, was not something to reach for. It was a place to be, a place where time blurred and moments became infinite. The horizon was not a destination. It was a reminder that there was always something beyond, something waiting just out of reach, always just a little further along. It was a promise that life would continue, even after the years had passed. Isabella touched his arm gently, a silent affirmation of the thought that had crossed his mind. She, too, understood. They had spent their lives walking beside each other, hand in hand, but it was not the destination that mattered. It was the journey. The moments they had shared, the love that had grown between them, was the true prize of life. And in that moment, with the sun rising on a new day, they both understood that this was enough. They had lived, they had loved, and that was all they had ever needed. The light from the morning sky bathed them in a soft glow, and for a fleeting moment, everything seemed to slow down. The weight of time, the passage of years, became a mere whisper in the background. All that was left was the present, this shared moment, this quiet, undisturbed moment of peace. They had learned that love, in its truest form, was not bound by time. It was not dependent on youth, on age, on anything other than the hearts that chose to give themselves fully to one another. And as Gabriel and Isabella stood together, the future no longer felt uncertain. There would be no grand declarations, no desperate need for resolution. They had already found what they had been looking for. It was here, in the quiet moments, in the silence between them, in the love that had grown over the years, stronger and deeper than either had imagined. Time, as it had passed, had not robbed them of anything. It had given them everything they needed. And so, they stood there, not looking to the future, not clinging to the past, but simply being in the present, together. The horizon stretched before them, endless and full of promise. And as the morning light spread across the land, Gabriel and Isabella knew that no matter what lay beyond that horizon, they had already found their place in the world, side by side.